Hello and welcome to our inaugural virtual Johnson County Master Gardeners Continuing Education Program. I am Doug Garretts. I'm the Vice Chair of the organization as well as editor of the Times newsletter. Although we paused our in-person continuing education programming out of concern during the global coronavirus pandemic this past year, we are pleased to resume our education programs virtually. And many thanks to Linda Schreiber and Shannon for getting everything set up and established for this series of programs. These programs will allow master gardeners to have the opportunity to learn and share during these challenging times. We expect it will be a learning curve for us and for you as we do our first virtual events, so we appreciate your patience. Our continuing education session is free with required registration. Master gardeners from surrounding counties who have completed their initial training are also invited to participate. If there is a topic that you would like to have covered, or if you would like to present to our group, please let us know, as we are always looking for speakers. Today I'm pleased to introduce Iowa Master Naturalist Eric Miller, who is presenting the joys and challenges of native plant gardening. Eric has led numerous groups on field trips to highlight the unique qualities of the Iowa prairie. Iowa is the only state that lies entirely within the natural region of the tallgrass prairie. Early documents indicate that 95% of the state, or close to 30 million acres, at one time was covered by prairie vegetation. Eric will cover the challenges of incorporating native plants into your home garden and highlight how gardeners who incorporate urban flower prairie species into their landscape provide enjoyment for gardeners and habitat for wildlife. Goldfinches, hummingbirds, butterflies, and other species will take up permanent residence in your garden if you have prairie plants. Now retired from teaching at the collegiate level, Eric is an English as a second language instructor. He is actively involved with the Friends of Hickory Hill and an administrator of the Iowa City Native Plants Gardeners Facebook page, dedicated to growing and preserving plants native to Eastern North America and especially Iowa. So Eric, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Doug, and thank you everyone for joining us today on a day right after yet another snowfall. It's perhaps nice to start turning our thoughts toward spring, which will eventually arrive, and to begin planning our gardens for the year. By the way, before we go on, I should mention that native plant seed can be sown still before spring, and of course in spring, but it can still be sown outdoors, in fact, now, right on top of the soil. And actually, there are some reasons why now a snow sowing right now would actually be a good thing to do, but perhaps we can talk about that later on. I want to say thanks to the Johnson County Master Gardeners for having me today. Again, thanks all for joining us here and on Facebook. And I should also clarify that my ESL teaching is rather a side gig right now. And my main job for the last several years has been cashiering at New Pioneer Food Co-op, a job that I love a great deal and have met many people in the community through, and perhaps I have some of my customers and perhaps even co-workers participating today. So thank you all, and let's get started. I'm going to have folks muted until the end of the PowerPoint, but you can certainly write in questions via chat. And once I'm through all the slides, normally I would have this be more interactive, but the technology doesn't really lend itself to that very well. So once we make it through all the slides, there'll be a hopefully fairly long question and answer period where people can submit questions via chat, and we can address the questions as they arise. All right. Joys and challenges of native plant gardening. Again, to reiterate, my name is Eric Miller. By the way, there's some contact information at the bottom of this slide, and also I can make this slide, I can make this presentation available to people in a PDF format if you're interested. So feel free to contact Master Gardeners about how to get a hold of me, or if you have time, you might jot down the email address that you see at the base of this slide in rather fine print, unfortunately. I have an email address there, but you can also contact me through Facebook by going to the IC Native Plant Gardeners page on Facebook. I welcome contact with you to talk about getting a copy of the presentation and just to talk about whatever else you'd like to discuss. I wanted to start off today talking about sort of why we want to plant native plants, and talking about some of the values that inform native plant gardening and traditional gardening. Now, this is perhaps a little overgeneralized, so bear with me on here. I certainly don't want to be dissing traditional gardening by any means. So I'm kind of making these distinctions with a bit of a grain of salt, kind of creating ideal types that maybe are a little exaggerated, but I think you'll see the logic of why I'm doing this. So let's start with the first paradigm there, traditional gardening. Its values were mostly about aesthetics. I'm sure those of you who have been engaged in gardening over the years have had more than just beauty in mind as you garden, that you have been concerned with the environmental impacts of what you're doing in the garden. I have no doubt that's been a part of it for you, but beauty and a certain kind of aesthetic has been more or less the main focus of gardening traditionally. And though it's changed some in recent years, that was certainly the dominating value of gardening in the past. Landscape, I draw a distinction between that and landscape restoration. I'm talking about prairie restoration, woodland restoration, etc. The motivating factor for restorationists, has somewhat to do with aesthetics, but the main focus, of course, is ecological. Somebody who wants to restore a prairie, it may be rather secondary to that person how that prairie looks. They just really want to get it back to what it would have looked like prior to human intervention. Similar with folks that are restoring woodlands. With a home gardening approach with native plants, we're more or less trying to balance the above. We're sort of wanting things to look good, but we also have ecological factors in mind as we try to create our garden spaces. And this will come up time and again throughout the remaining slides that we're going to go through here. And I think you'll see how balancing the two things is a worthwhile thing to do, but that it certainly can be tricky. And there are certainly some challenges involved in doing that. So what are the joys of native plant gardening? Well, certainly aesthetics is part of it. Many native plants are highly quote unquote garden worthy and beautiful additions to the traditional garden. Um, Boy, I would challenge anyone to beat the beauty of a prairie and in midsummer when it's in full bloom, a woodland. And by the way, we're not going to limit ourselves to a discussion of prairie today. I also want to bring in native woodland plants as well. A woodland in spring when the spring ephemerals are blooming, it's about as beautiful as anything you'll find in any cultivated garden. But again, we're also about ecological values. Um, Many native plants have the added value of supplying food for beautiful and ecologically vital pollinators, birds, and other species, which in turn are themselves quite beautiful and enjoyable to watch and interesting to study as well. Growing natives satisfies both aesthetic and ethical ecological needs. It is a, therefore, feel-good type of gardening, I would argue, and one has the added satisfaction when growing native plants of knowing that he or she is contributing to the ecological health of the environment that one finds themselves in. There's also a number of practical benefits of native plant gardening. I guess you could call these joys in the sense that, maybe they save you a little bit of labor. Natives certainly can be lower maintenance than non-native plants. For example, they may have lower water needs once they're established, so not as much watering as traditional garden plants might require. But I want to state some caveats about that as we move through. In future slides, we're going to talk about how let's not be too seduced by the idea that native plant gardening is that much easier than regular gardening or traditional gardening. Native plants provide a number of ecosystem services. This kind of hot term that people are using now in environmental studies, various ecological services, including they have deep root systems that filter water and help control runoff. So you can accomplish a lot of goals in sort of stormwater management by planting native plants. And they have many other ecosystem services as well. All right, now on to the challenges. Common assumption is that the most ecological form of gardening is to simply let everything go wild, quote unquote. Lots of problems with that. Okay. For one, let's say you're trying to create a small prairie. If you simply let that prairie go, over time, woody plants, trees are going, and shrubs are going to make their way into that prairie planting, and eventually you're going to have a wood lot where you once had a prairie. So you can't just sort of leave it alone and expect it to remain the way that you want it to be. Many native plants are quite tall and have a tendency to flop. And this may or may not be a problem in your mind. Certainly in a big prairie planting, you wouldn't even notice if, a significant number of the plants were flopping over. But in a small garden planting, those things would probably be pretty obvious. It might detract from the appearance of your garden, especially if people around you have that more traditional way of looking at gardens as being especially aesthetic in nature, needing to fit a certain aesthetic and needing to have a controlled look about them. By the way, the picture of yours truly there on the left, that is me standing next to a sawtooth sunflower plant. I'm 5'8", so do the math. There's easily two of me there, right? and maybe a little bit more. So we might be talking about like a 12-foot plant there. So yeah, got to do something about those floppers, you know, especially if your neighbors or your house, your housing association is particularly concerned about a controlled look on your grounds. Predation is another issue. I'll say more about that in a little bit in case you don't know what I mean by that. Spreading of the plants. Again, I'll come back to that in a future slide. And then finally, just kind of a catch-all, you know, intangible category, weediness, a generally unkempt, out of control look. What can we do about that? And again, that's you know, kind of using the traditional gardening paradigm, or compromising with it, I guess, is what I want to say, as growers of native plants. Let's talk about woody encroachment and weeds. Before European conquest, control of prairie communities and woodland native plant communities, NP is for native plant, was done by fire. Of course, fires swept through the prairies, but also through the woodlands of Iowa prior to European conquest. And the fires kind of kept the prairie looking like prairie, right? They kept woody growth out for the most part. Even though fires burned in woodlands, they didn't kill the more mature trees, but they kept the you know, they kept the areas below the tree canopy from getting too clogged up and full of shrubs and such, so that there was a sort of open look to Iowa woodlands prior to European conquest. In the native plant garden, more intensive human maintenance is needed. Now, I'm working under the assumption here that people are interested in growing native plants in relatively small garden settings. This presentation is not so much oriented toward those who have an acre prairie or a 5-acre prairie for certainly, but for those folks who want to have a garden in a relatively small space and in areas where the neighbors are not too far away. Those kinds of circumstances do not lend themselves very well to burning. So we have to supply human labor in the place of fire if we're going to grow native plants in these kinds of settings. My mantra is low maintenance does not equal no maintenance. And indeed, this is something that I preach a lot, because I see a lot of prairie plantings around town here in Iowa City where someone has, you know, sown some prairie seed and they have a pretty decent prairie going, but it isn't maintained. And over time, you start to get woody growth, you start to get non-native plants infiltrating what was supposed to be prairie, and pretty soon it doesn't look very good, okay, either from an aesthetic standpoint, nor is it serving the ecological purposes that a prairie should serve. So mowing, believe it or not, mowing is a perfectly fine thing to do, and indeed is necessary to some degree in native plantings, especially if you're trying to grow like a little postage stamp prairie. You'll probably want to sow the seed for that one year, and the next year you want to mow it with your mowing base at a relatively high setting, right? You're going to want to do that the first year, perhaps the second year as well. The idea is you kind of mow off the non-native plant seed heads, right, or flower heads, and then the other plants, which tend to be more warm season type of plants that mature later in the season, they kind of have a chance to catch up with those cool season European species that tend to really shoot up in the spring here in the Midwest. Mechanical removal, you just got to get in there and cut out, dig up, maybe treat woody plants. A lot of people don't like the idea of using chemical treatment, and I entirely get that. Um, Digging is possible. Granted, it's very laborious. Maybe cutting and covering the stump with a tin can, something like that, and also removing non-natives. If you have a relatively small garden, mulching, smothering with cardboard or landscape fabric can help control quote unquote weeds. And by the way, I'm using the word weeds here to mean non-native plants for the most part. I have a lot of problems with the word weed. I hearken back to Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said that a weed is a plant whose virtues have not yet been discovered. But that said, there are certain plants that we don't want to encroach very much on our native plantings, or they will take them over. And if we want to grow native plants, we need to always be vigilant about non-native, weedier plants coming in and outcompeting them. Compact or tight plant spacing can help a lot with choking out weeds and other competitors with our native plants. I mentioned flopping earlier. Remember that tall sawtooth sunflower? You know, that can be a problem, and it can create issues with your neighbors. You know, they might feel like your native planting just doesn't look very good because of those tall plants that can tend to flop over. You can get around that, of course, by growing plants that don't get that tall, right? You can grow a very low growing plant. I have a photograph here of a plant called Missouri evening primrose. I think a really beautiful plant. Missouri evening primrose, Latin Oenothera macrocarpa. Not technically native to Iowa, but I have a rather expansive definition of native. I feel like plants that are perhaps just outside of our growing area are okay, especially those to our south, because as the climate changes, the ranges of these plants is going to start moving north. If you decide, hey, I don't want to limit myself to low growing plants, but I also don't want to get on my homeowners association crap list, so I'm going to go ahead and stake and support plants that get real tall. I'm going to use fencing, etc. Another thing that you can do is you can take real tall growing plants and you can just cut them back early in the season, and they'll grow in a more compact fashion that way. Sometimes native plants that are normally tall and lanky have been bred by breeders to make them more compact. I've seen some asters that have been bred to assume a more compact shape. There's a lot of controversy about these plants. A plant that has been bred by humans is called a cultivar, and a plant that was originally a native we call nativars, right? Cultivated natives that have been bred for certain desirable traits. The issue with those is, do they have the same ecological benefits as their wild cousins? And we can talk more about that at the end of the presentation if anyone has questions about that. Predation. So if you have a plant that gets consumed by insects, for example, you might end up with leaves on a given plant that really look riddled and don't, again, fit that traditional garden aesthetic, right? couple of things about that. You can treat them, of course, with eco-safe processes, or just learn to live with some disfigurement of your plants, because after all, part of what we're trying to do is grow plants because of the place they fill in the ecosystem. And guess what? The part that plants play in the ecosystem is at least partly as food for other creatures, right? For other living things. And I know this can be tricky. You don't want things to get sort of grossly unsightly. But it's a good idea to kind of keep in mind the words of a famous native plant advocate, Doug Ptolemy, that a plant that goes uneaten has failed to fulfill its ecological purpose. He also has done research that shows that, generally speaking, you're not going to get more than about 10% destruction of plant material if you don't use herbicides and pesticides, and that most people won't even notice that relatively minimal amount of predation. So, yeah, it's important to keep that in mind too. Perhaps we can sacrifice a little bit of our foliage for the good of the ecosystem and for critters that want to feed on that plant material. We again want to balance aesthetic and ecological concerns. Spreading is an issue which we want to control by harvesting seed heads before dispersal. When I first started growing natives, I thought, I had learned that, the prairies had been destroyed and, it was going to be really hard to bring them back. And I thought, it must take forever for prairie plants to get established. But believe me, prairie plant seeds can find purchase in your neighbor's flower bed and grow quite prolifically. So you want to be really careful about that if you, again, want to maintain good relations with your neighbors. With an unkempt look, some things you can do are to combat the unkemptness by making things look intentional. Can't overemphasize intentionality too much. You can use mulch to dress up the native plant garden. Mulch can help with weed control so that you have the plants in the places you want them and not elsewhere. Wood chips, rock, etc. Can really dress up a garden and make it look nice. One caveat here, it's not a good idea to cover everything. And again, because we're doing what we're doing here, at least in part for ecological reasons, we need to leave some bare ground because many species need access to the bare ground. Many insects, for example, such as ground-dwelling bees and bumblebees, by the way, generally speaking, want to winter if not underground, at least in leafy material just above the ground. So we don't want to cover everything with impenetrable mulch. Borders can help dress up the garden. Paths, so you're not mowing everything because you've decided you want to give up a uniform lawn, but having some mowed areas adjacent to your native plantings can really make them look nice, make them look more intentional. Signage. If you jump on the National Wildlife Federation website, you can get one of these signs that you see on the left of the slide there. They won't send out goons to check your yard to make sure that, in fact, you qualify as a certified wildlife habitat. It's more or less on the honor system. You just tell them, yes, I'm providing water for species. Yes, I'm providing natives and so forth. And they will send you one of these signs that you can put up, and your neighbors will perhaps give you a little slack if things look a little weedy. An issue with many natives is the lack of continuous bloom. Sometimes they, you know, either take a long time to bloom, so they just look like green, maybe quote unquote weeds most of the season, and only late in the season do they explode into bloom, and then they really look beautiful. I've had this issue where I live. You know, good part of the season, my plants don't look like much, but then mid to late summer, when many prairie species really come into their own, it just explodes in color, and all of a sudden, all my neighbors are slapping my back and telling me how nice my garden looks. Obviously, oh, and spring ephemerals especially, right? These are often woodland plants that die back early in the season. You know, a bit like daffodils do, right? Daffodils and some other really early blooming non-natives will die back early in the season. Sometimes the foliage persists, sometimes it doesn't. And if a plant loses its bloom, or you know, early, or it doesn't bloom until late, of course that foliage can be beautiful in its own right, but you know, it may not quite fit the aesthetics of your neighborhood, you know, where people want they're not interested in foliage unless it's, you know, variegated or striped or something like that. So maybe you know, bear that in mind, and intersperse with some plants that bloom early, mid, or late season, right? Along with some species that have a long bloom time. Another thing you can do, though, of course, at the top here in the list of solutions, is to educate about or sell your neighbors a different aesthetic. And maybe they can learn to start appreciating the beauty of the foliage without it having to have some, you know, snazzy striping or variegation on it. A lot of times when we have ephemeral plants that die back, their foliage can start to look rather haggard late in the summer. You can certainly remove that so it doesn't look so bad. Again, you know, if your focus is mostly environmental, ecological, it's a good idea to leave some dead plant material in the fall for, you know, housing, basically, for overwintering insects. There's a lot of bees that like to lay their eggs in the stems of plants, and their eggs or larvae will overwinter in those stems, and then those bees can emerge from the stem in the spring and go on to pollinate other, you know, our flowers, our ornamentals, as well as to pollinate many of the foods that we eat. And Lord knows we are dependent for about a third of our diets. We are dependent on bees, which do the pollinating of that third of plants that we eat. So, native plant gardening, not necessarily much easier than other types of gardening, confronts us with many challenges. Are the rewards worth it? Do the rewards make it worth confronting the challenges of native plant gardening? Well, certainly, just to reiterate here, native plants are aesthetically beautiful. They are fascinating, lovely things, and very interesting to look at, as is the fauna that those plants attract. Often very beautiful. Even the less beautiful insects that are attracted to our plants are nevertheless often very fascinating to look at. They provide ecosystem services, a number of them, too many to list. And the knowledge that one is contributing to the health of the ecosystem is a big part of this as well. I want to finish with a quote from Doug Ptolemy here, from his book, Bringing Nature Home. Now, for the first time in its history, gardening has taken on a role that transcends the needs of the gardener. Like it or not, gardeners have become important players in the management of our nation's wildlife. Like it or not, gardeners have become important players in the management of our nation's wildlife. It is now within the power of individual gardeners to do something that we all dream of doing, to make a difference. And indeed, gang, when you decide how you're going to garden, you know, it used to be perhaps that, you know, we thought that a person's property was theirs to do with as they please. And I'm not going to go all commie on you here, but I think now we have to face the ethics of what we decide to plant. Because some non-native plants that we might choose are in fact invasive and can take over the native plants in our adjacent woodlots or prairies. Some plants are not usable, particularly usable by pollinators and other insects, which we need obviously to pollinate our food. We need these native insects that have co-evolved with the native plants in order to feed the birds that we love to look at. We need the butterflies, if only for aesthetic value, and so on. So what you choose to do in your garden is really an ethical statement, whether to do something that is ecologically good, ecologically maybe neutral, or counterproductive. And the beauty of that is that what we do in our humble gardening plots can actually contribute to the persistence of our native species of insects, and can preserve the beautiful native plants that once thrived in Iowa. I have, after this, a photo gallery of native plantings, but we're well past the halfway point here. So I want to stop and start taking questions. I also don't want to just, you know, bore everyone to tears. So if folks would like to start sending in some questions via chat, I would be happy to take those.
Let me start, Eric, by asking you, you have particular favorite native plants for the home garden?
You know, it's interesting. I was confronted with that question before I came on today, and there are many species that I really love a great deal. So it's hard to kind of narrow them down. And a lot depends upon what we, you know, it's like favorite for what, I guess, is what I want to say. Let me show you in my gallery here. There's a plant in the lower left-hand corner here. Can you see the hand on my screen here moving around, or can you not see that?
Cannot see it.
Okay. Well, in the far lower left-hand corner, there is a hosta, a variegated hosta. And by the way, this is a really beautiful shade garden on, I believe it's Roosevelt Street, that combines native and non-native plants in an especially beautiful way. So right next to this non-native hosta, unfortunately, hostas are not native. They have a growth aspect that, you know, makes me jealous. I wish they were native. But right next to that, you'll see a lot of a sort of roundish leaved plant here. Looks sort of like violet foliage. That is wild ginger. And I really like that plant a lot for several reasons. It's probably the best native ground cover we have. It does want to grow in shade, but that's a beneficial thing, I think, because people can't get things to grow in shade often. And its foliage is persistent throughout the season. It will last all the way until fall. Might need a little water to keep it looking good, but otherwise that is a persistent, very persistent foliage plant. So that's when it comes to woodland plants. Now, as for prairie plants, it's a little harder for me to decide. I really like grasses a lot. And on my slideshow here, my gallery of native plantings, I have, sorry, let me go back to that. This is a home that is at the corner of Washington and First Avenue in Iowa City. And it's essentially right behind City High. You can see City High in the far right there. And this person, a good friend of mine, has really done, she's really incorporated a lot of great native plant sort of hacks to make her garden look especially nice. So she's used borders here, right? She's got this sort of fake rock border, and she's got a beautiful bed of mulch here, which you can't see right now. But in the flower bed itself is a lot of big blue stem grass. And this is in the autumn, and you can see this beautiful color that the grass attains in the autumn. It's beautiful all season long. It has sort of a bluish green cast in the summer, and then this kind of yellowish reddish color in the fall. So big blue stem maybe is my favorite among prairie plants, and wild ginger, one of the favorites among woodland plants. Other questions?
Can you see the one that came in on the chat?
I don't see it just because of the way we have this set up here.
Okay,
Here we go. I got it now.
Got it?
Yes.
First,
Is this from Vicky?
yes.
Hey, Vicky, thanks for the question. I've been growing milkweed to feed the monarch caterpillars. The milkweed seems to spread more every year, and I'm wondering how I can keep it from invading the neighbor's more tidy garden. I stake my milkweed because it does get quite large. Yeah, I would just recommend a really good sheet mulch around it to keep it from spreading vegetatively. So, if you want to get fancy with some landscape fabric, or you can just go to the grocery store and pull some cardboard out of your local grocery store dumpster and put it around the area where the milkweed is growing, and maybe throw some wood chips on top of it. You probably want to remove the seed pods in late summer or fall so that the seed doesn't spread. Those would be my suggestions.
Another question came in, Eric.
Okay. This is from Linda, the sensory garden question.
Correct.
I am designing a sensory garden for our preschool. Never heard of that. Please give me suggestions for native plants that have a sound feature. Yeah, oh gosh. Grasses are really wonderful for when the wind blows. And you can hear the sound through the grasses. I would suggest some that maybe dry in the fall and have a lovely kind of crispness to them, like maybe cup plant, that again would make some sound when the wind blows through it. Some plants with especially rough textures, you could sort of rub your hand across them and sort of hear the sound that would make.
What are the most fragrant native?
For that, I would suggest probably wild bergamot. So called because it smells like the bergamot that is used to flavor Earl Grey tea. So it's really a wonderful plant. Others with really lovely fragrance. There's a lot of them out there, certainly. Joe Pye weed is one that has a lovely scent. Surely many more that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head here. Other questions? Yes. Again, the touch feature there from Linda. So there's I'm going to type this out. I don't know if people can see it, but there's a genus of plants, the silphiums, and this includes cup plant and rosinweed and compass plant. They all have a very fascinating prairie dock as well. They all have a really rough texture, and they're kind of fun to play around with. The compass plant has a big kind of oak-shaped leaf that will have that, when you touch it in the summer, the veins of the leaf are cool to the touch. There's fluid flowing through them, and you can actually feel that they are cooler, a little bit cooler than the ambient air temperature. Yes. Hyssop has a wonderful licorice smell. Nancy reminds me that anise hyssop has a wonderful licorice scent to it. There are a number of plants that are licoricey, I guess you could say. There's a plant called sweet Sicily, similar kind of thing, a very anise scent to it. It's a woodland plant, but yeah. Other nice touch plants, there's one called stiff goldenrod. And I'm using mostly, obviously common names here. So certainly, you want to look up the Latin for these. But stiff goldenrod has a very soft leaf. So it's sort of the opposite of the silphiums. Stiff goldenrod, very, very, very soft leaf that kind of just grows in sort of one rounded kind of oval shape at the top. Very fuzzy, like lamb's ears that you find in the garden, especially early in the season.
I always thought that milkweed had an interesting texture in its leaves. And you could also have them touch the white exudate that comes out of the plant.
Indeed.
Weediness.
Yeah, that's a lot of fun. And, it's fun to, break open a leaf and say, so why do you guys think this is called milkweed? And it's always interesting to talk too about the poisons that, the toxins that are in the milky sap that make monarchs unpalatable to birds. And protect the monarchs and protect the monarch caterpillars from many predators. Many, but not all predators. My Iowa Master Naturalist training. So there's an organization. Yeah, I got a question about the Iowa Master Naturalist training. There's an organization in Iowa called Iowa Master Naturalists. You can look them up on Facebook. They have a website, etc. Just type Iowa Master Naturalist, you're bound to find them. And they have a program, it's usually by season, so they'll have a spring, a summer, and a fall training. set of training sessions, and you go through one of these quote unquote semesters of study with Iowa Master Naturalists. And yeah, at the end of it, you are certified to work as a volunteer naturalist. Actually, I should qualify that. After you go through the training, then you have to put in a certain number of volunteer hours helping with some, kind of naturalist work of some kind of work in the outdoors. Might be prairie restoration work, it might be invasive vegetation removal, it might be leading hikes, teaching about prairies, teaching about woodlands, etc. And at the culmination of that service work, you will get an Iowa Master Naturalist certificate.
Is it associated with Iowa State, like the Master Gardener?
It is not. It is not. Now, I should mention that so Iowa State is associated with the Iowa Master Gardeners program, and the Master Gardeners programs tend to come through the Extension Service offices. There's also an Iowa State Iowa Master Conservationist program, and that is sort of like the Iowa Master Naturalist program in that you become certified at the culmination of it, and it has more like institutional ties with the Master Gardening program that many of you are members of. By the way, I want to point out, until we get another question, some of the techniques here that some of these gardens employ. I mentioned earlier about fencing to support prairie plants. This person has done a really good job with fencing. It's got a green coloration to it, which helps it to blend in with the plants in the summer. You can see again the borders along the left side. I'm talking about the left frame of the slide here. In the right frame, you can again see the borders. This is a view from the front of the same place. On the right in this PowerPoint, you can see one of the medians that the city has planted on Washington Street, right here in Iowa City. The plants here are mostly, if not entirely, native. So you have purple coneflower kind of on the left here. You can see the flower heads against the vehicles. You have a really lovely native called purple prairie clover kind of next to that. Between that and then what appears to be grasses that are growing along the edge of the median here, those are actually sedges. Sedges are a grass-like plant that is really an attractive addition to a native plant garden. Are there special preparations that gardeners must do in their gardens before incorporating native plants? Actually, not so much. You can make soil amendments of this sort or that sort. And, I personally am rather lazy about that. And frankly, Iowa native plants are adapted to grow in Iowa soil. And it's pretty surprising how well native plants will do, in my experience anyway, in soils that are high in clay, soils that are not necessarily good soils. Now, I want to state a caveat about that. There are some native plants that are very, very picky, that favor dry growing conditions. So you need amendments like sand, for example, tons of organic matter. That's always number one in any garden. And sometimes perhaps some changes to the pH of the soil. There are a few plants that are native here that grow in boggy areas and really prefer a more of an acid pH. But generally speaking, not so much. You can just kind of throw seed onto any patch of ground. You know, put out plant sets if you want to. What steps would you recommend to turn a 20 by 20 foot of turf into a garden with native plants? Can't emphasize it enough. Smother, smother, smother. So again, you can spend money on, you know, a fancy schmancy smothering material, but I find cardboard works really well. Throw some cardboard down on some lawn grass, let it go, admittedly a long time, several months perhaps, and then you can pull it up. Most of the grass will be dead and you can then plant it. I've heard that an even better strategy is something called solarizing. So you put down clear plastic over the lawn, and not only does it eventually kill the grass, it also kills the seed that smothering won't kill. I mentioned nativars. Are those commercially available, and are they labeled as such? Not always. So anytime you go to a nursery and you buy a native plant, there's a pretty good chance that it's a cultivar of a native rather than being a native. And you want to look out for that because, you know, it may not, in fact, have those same ecological benefits that, that the true native does. For example, there are numerous cultivars. I'm not saying, yeah, okay, yes, numerous cultivars that have been bred to have what some people call double blooms or multiple blooms. So, you know, when you buy a carnation at the store for your lapel, right, or at a florist for your lapel, it's all petals, and there's no actual reproductive parts in the flower sometimes. And I've seen a plant called false sunflower, oxeye, early sunflower, which is a beautiful native plant. I've seen it bred for double blooms, and when it's bred for double blooms, it no longer has those floral reproductive parts that feed pollinators. So, you know, it may be a lovely plant, but is it fulfilling that ecological function that its wild cousins are filling? Obviously not in that case. Sometimes nativars are labeled, or sometimes it's obvious that they are nativars. There's a company that puts out a lot of nativars, some of which are probably perfectly, you know, good at performing ecological functions. The name of the company is American Beauties, or rather, that's the sort of brand that it gives its nativars. Okay. American Beauties.
Eric, we're just about out of time here. Thank you for your informative presentation and answering questions.
Thank you again so much, and thank you everybody for attending. Feel free to give me a holler at my Facebook page or my email address. And again, the email is here at the end of the PowerPoint presentation if I can get there in time. And I welcome your contact.
If you're interested in attending future Johnson County Master Gardening activities, please watch our Facebook page for information. Johnson County offers Master Gardener classes in the fall. For information, please call the Extension office at 337-2145. That's 337-2145. Thank you for joining us. Everyone have a great afternoon.